Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Just Talking. I am your host, Julius Freeman. With me today is Trevor Mueller, a comic book writer from Chicago. He currently has two projects on Webtoons, one called Nexus Point and the other called Repossessed. He is also a multi-Harvey Award nominated writer for Albert the Alien and has also self-published several comic books, which include Consumer, Beyond the Pillars, Los Ojos, Demon City, and The Witches of Ewick Boulevard. And on top of that, he has his own website, trevormueller.com, where he regularly reviews movies, video games, and comics. I would say you're probably the hardest working comic book writer today, I would say. Welcome to the show, Trevor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I do what I can. It's definitely an exercise in time management to try to get this much stuff done. But honestly, it's a product of the pandemic was just very good in terms of freeing up a lot of time that would normally be spent on other things, and you fill that time with stuff. And I just decided to fill it with being productive. So that's what kind of motivated me.
I'll start with the first question. Who are you, and what sparked your journey to want to be a writer? Not just a writer for comics, but just a writer in general. Because writing is such a, I'm sure you know, it's a journey of itself. When you sit down, put pen to paper, or fingers to keyboards, whichever approach it is. What was it that prompted you to want to be a writer?
Yeah, so your first question, who am I? I'm Trevor Mueller, and I got my start kind of going to school in business and advertising, but I've been making comic books my whole life. Back from when I could first hold a pencil in my hand.
Nice.
Taking pieces of lined paper and drawing, the adventures of Stupid Man, who was like a kid who got like a cape that helped him to fly, and he stopped school bullies from like beating up other people in school, and it was silly and basic and stupid, but it kind of spawned that love of visual storytelling. And I've been making comics constantly basically my whole life, trying to sell them throughout like middle school and high school, as I did like photocopies of some of these other comics I was doing. It was not a Batman licensed product, but it very much looked like something like Batman, with a different name because we didn't want to get sued. And then just in high school, just kept reading all these really silly books about superheroes, and I created a character called G-Man, the Defender of Food, in a world where superheroes exist and everybody's got their niche. G-Man is the one that goes out and saves the food because somebody else is going to go save those people. It was just silly and fun and goofy, and I like to inject like this bizarre brand of humor into some of the stuff that I do. So why a writer? I was drawing a lot of those comics up and through college when I started doing web comics regularly. And as my stories got more and more ambitious, they started to exceed my skill level when it came to actually transposing those from my head onto the page. And so that's where you have to start partnering with other people who have that skill set, who have a little bit more discipline in their art. I can do a great talking heads gag strip, not a problem. When it comes to doing like, action sequences with a lot of motion and a lot of dynamic camera angles and those types of things, I tend to require a little bit of assistance there. And the collaborative nature of comics is one that is just so rewarding, because sometimes the way that you're picturing it in your head as you're writing is different than what the artist ends up delivering to you. And most of the time, what they deliver is better. And so that's just been such a rewarding experience. So I started just kind of doing the writing thing after 2012, and I really haven't looked back at trying to illustrate my own stories since.
So that's a good segue to my next question. How do you approach your working relationship with artists? What's your collaborative relationship like with artists?
Sure. So I try to tailor my approach to the artist's desires, and I usually ask them, like, do you want more description, less description? Do you
Oh,
want
nice.
assistance with layouts? Or do you want freedom to kind of have that blank canvas of a page to do with as you will?
Nice.
And some artists will ask for more. Some will ask for more freedom uh, than on
Of
there.
course.
I'm not an Alan Moore kind of writer. I'm not writing paragraphs for a single panel on a 9-page grid.
Right.
Uh, that's not the way that I approach it. I like the collaborative nature. And oftentimes, again, giving the artist more freedom does get you a little bit more of a surprise at the end. When I do work with my artists, I do, we usually have a contract in place, and I usually ask for a number of revisions
Ah,
to be baked into the rate that we do, just in case something pops up where it's, I didn't communicate something clearly, or I do have a particular vision, or they turn in something that, I didn't like as much, and I'd like them to try to resolve it a bit. And if we can't get it done within that revision window, then I owe them more money, right? Like I'm doing a
right. Of
poor
course.
job of communicating. At the end of the day, the script that I work on is a communication tool to the artist. And if I can't tell them what needs to be in that page or how the sequence flows properly, then I've failed as a communicator. And working with a lot of international creators as my artist partners, English is not always a first language. And so there are
Right.
times where we do have to come in. One of my favorite examples, I'll tell you a quick story. I wrote a sequence where it's supposed to be kind of a researching montage, right? And the line of the panel was, the main character goes through a stack of papers. And we think about like maybe somebody sitting at a desk, opening up a file, like looking
Mm-hmm.
at paperwork and trying to like research and do the thing they're doing. The artist, who was not a native English speaker, did not interpret it that way, and ended up drawing like a stack of papers, like the stacks of books from the Ghostbusters
Right.
movie,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
main character is running through them.
Oh, God.
And I was like, my bad. I get it. That was not the intention. Should not have assumed. And
Right.
so now I get a little bit more descriptive where I'm like, character sits at a desk,
Yes.
has opened a file and is looking through paperwork on his desk. So I just had to revise my style a little bit, put a little bit more detail in there, especially for some of my creators where English is a second language.
Great story. I've had similar similar situations myself, which is why I laugh so hard because you're right. It teaches you, it forces you to write a little bit more simpler, I guess the right word.
Well, it's a direct and
Yeah,
descriptive,
there you
right?
go. There
So
you go.
you don't necessarily need a paragraph to describe what's going on there, but if you're picturing somebody sitting at a desk leafing through a file, that's different than a character goes through a stack of papers, right?
Yeah.
So
That's
it taught
great.
me a valuable lesson. And again,
Yeah,
thankfully, it was the first revision in our revision clause, so we were okay. It was one panel. We caught it early in layouts.
there you go. There you go.
So,
That's the important part right there is catching it in the first stages of the layout editing process because if you don't catch it then there's going to be trouble ahead.
exactly.
Okay, so my next question, since you mentioned you started drawing comics as a young child, what was it which comic books were the comic books that inspired you to want to draw and write your own comic books as a child?
Oh man, that's an excellent question. Because I didn't have a pull box until Image Comics
Mm,
probably came around. But back in my day, and I'm about to age myself, my parents would leave me in the magazine aisle at the grocery store while they were going grocery shopping. And if I
ah,
behaved, they would buy me a couple of comics off of the spinner rack. So we're talking like
nice.
Archie era Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles,
Yeah,
Zen
yeah,
the Intergalactic Ninja,
yeah,
and the occasional
yeah.
X-Men book. I remember when I got my tonsils out too, like my parents just went and got me like a whole stack of just like dollar bin comics. I think they were like 10-cent bin comics back then. So like Guardians of the Galaxy, Daredevil, right?
Nice.
I had a whole bunch of the Batman Death in the Family books, like
Oh, nice
some of the
classics.
classic ones were at the
Yeah,
time, right? Like they didn't have the iconic kind of storyline, or they weren't thought of as iconically as they
right.
are kind of today. It was another Batman story. And so I was consuming, I think, a lot of those, a lot of indie titles as well. Again, Zen was very like off kilter and not very mainstream. The classic Eastman and Laird Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles books.
Nice.
So
Nice.
those kinds of things. Flaming Carrot.
Oh,
You know?
dude, awesome.
Yeah, it was those kinds of things. Like I would just collect a hodgepodge of different kind of comics, and it was tricky at the time because everything was like interconnected. Like an issue of
Right.
X-Men would reference like 5 to
Right. Yeah.
12 issues earlier, and you're like, "Oh, but I can't find that issue." Like
Right.
trade
Right.
paperbacks weren't a thing. And so from a story continuity perspective, it was very difficult as a collector. As a young fan of comics, it was very easy to just pick something up and just be like, dude, the
Mm,
artwork is gorgeous. I like the story enough that I can follow what's going on, and I'm going to start getting the next one. But when Image came out, like that kind of changed the game for me because suddenly you were able to start at issue 1 for a whole
right.
plethora of new series. The artwork was gorgeous. They improved the paper quality, the printing, the colors were suddenly not just kind of like these monochrome dot matrix based kind of print
Right.
quality. I mean, they had digital colors on there that looked gorgeous. And I ate up every single title that was coming out of Image until, I started going through my allowance way too fast and then had to
Yeah.
start getting selective about which titles I maintained. But to me, that was kind of the game changer, and that was where I was like, "Whoa, hold on a second! This is something that I would love to do for the rest of my life."
Out of curiosity, which you don't have to name all of them, but which I guess you could say the top 2 Image comics that you had to go back every month to get. Which books were those? I'm curious to know.
So I still collect Savage Dragon to this day.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow. So do
and
you have all the issues starting from issue 1?
every single issue, including the mini series that they did, all the spin-offs, and then any
Wow.
of the cross titles that they did. So Eric Larson like
Right.
drew an issue of Wildcats. I bought that. Um, I was into Wildcats pretty young because again, X-Men was like a thing, and this was like
Yeah.
mature X-Men, and you're like, oh,
Right.
that's awesome. And then Witchblade, like Witchblade in the Darkness from Top Cow were
Great. Awesome
magnificent.
books. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
absolutely. Mark
collected
Silvestri,
Witchblade
man.
throughout the entire run when that ended, and like I want to say it was like issue 118 or something like that. I
Yeah,
got
Mark
all of them.
Silvestri. He drew all those issues, right? Or he only drew like the first few, and then he
Silvestri, my understanding is he illustrated the first arc, so about 6 issues of the
okay.
Darkness. But Michael Turner was on the
Michael
Witchblade book.
Turner. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Michael
that
Turner. Wow.
again, that artwork just blew my mind.
It blew everyone's mind. He's sorely missed because he definitely was. He was a game changer, I think,
Mhm.
for a lot of people when he came onto the scene because his artwork was just absolutely gorgeous and out of this world. And like I said, he's sorely missed. But so that's awesome that you have those issues that he drew and you have those collections. That's awesome. You truly are a comic book fan, Trevor.
I mean, behind me, right? Like,
Oh yeah, I mean, look at behind you. Exactly. That's only indicative of how much of a fan you are of comics, which is what this channel is about. This channel is about, interviewing people who are dedicated and love the medium because the comic book medium offers so much
hmm.
for storytelling. In my opinion, more so than movies and TV shows because there's so much you can do with the medium. All you need is a good artist and an active imagination, and you're set to go.
Well, and earlier you were talking about how, you used to draw your own comics as
Hmm.
well. And I think that that positions you and I in a unique place as comic book writers,
Right?
unlike somebody who's either never tackled comics before, had less exposure to comics as a reader, or whose background is in like film or stage-based kind of
Right.
writing. We
Yeah.
understand that comic books is a series of images, right?
Yeah.
Still images. And so you'll get there's all these script examples out there of even like Mark Millar and stuff like writing a panel that's Captain America throws his shield, hits 12 Hydra agents in the face, and the shield returns to his hand. Panel 1, panel 2, right? And you're like, you can't draw that, man. Like,
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. You
you're
gotta.
trying to describe a film sequence. You're not trying to
Yeah.
describe a panel in a comic book.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And I learned a lot from, believe it or not, Jim Shooter, because Jim Shooter used to have a blog years ago. I think it's still up now, but I think they condensed what he posted. but I was actively waiting for his post when he was actively on it, and I learned so much. It was a priceless, a school of hard knocks, because he came from that perspective of like, readers don't know what's going on when they pick up a new issue, new readers anyway. So
Mhm.
it's your job as a writer to uh, get them up to speed within the page. If you can't do that, then you failed as a comic book writer. And he's just, I know a lot of people don't like Jim Shooter, especially the old pros, but I think the new up and coming writers can learn a lot from Jim Shooter. And his blog is still up. I think it's jimshooter.com. I believe. I can't remember off the top of my head. But you're right. You're absolutely right when you say the comic book medium is way different from TV or film, because of that aspect of you could do so much with the medium in terms of camera angles, dynamic shots, and
There's no budget.
there's no budget. The only budget is the paying for the artist, right? The
Well,
artist
it's
services.
the budget is time, right? Like if you want
Exactly, and
to
that
have a
too.
2-page spread, or heaven forbid a 6-page insert
Okay.
that goes out into a poster, right?
Yeah.
It's just time. Yes,
Time.
you're paying the artist. I mean, there's budget attached to the project, but it's not like you've got to produce that in terms of like CG or practical effects or a
Right.
set or something.
Right.
And so the money flows a lot differently in terms of how you get that done. It's just making sure that you've got enough economical time for the artist to complete that image versus needing an entire crew to come in and build it, or a VFX specialist to come in and kind of design it in wireframe. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that you mentioned kind of Jim Shooter's approach there with the single page summary to get readers up to speed. Television does do that usually right after their commercial breaks,
Right.
where
Yeah.
they've got like 1 to 2 sentences to sit there and basically say, this is the story, this is what's happening, and now you're all caught up. Don't change the channel
Right.
because the adventure continues.
That's a nice segue for my next question. Why did you choose comics and not TV or film?
I originally wanted to do TV and film. And when I was going to college, so in high school, I was making a bunch of, fun films with my friends, just like goofing around, learning
Right.
about cameras, angles, lenses, lighting, all that good stuff. I was a producer on local community access cable that we had. So we were making like news programs, sports programs, interview, talk shows, all
Nice.
those kinds of things. And so I got to learn a bit of the behind the scenes on how a TV show gets run. And then, you just apply that to a fictional story that you get to write.
Yeah.
But my parents had instead encouraged me to go to a career that was a little bit more stable, which was marketing and advertising. So I had the business background. And they're like, regardless of what career you ultimately choose, having that business background is so critical, because we like to think of comics as entertainment, but comics is a business. Film
Absolutely.
is a business.
Yeah.
And you need to understand how the money flows in order to be profitable and in order to make a living doing it. The visual storytelling of comics for me was kind of an entry point in there. But the barrier to entry for comics was so much lower than everything else. And this is even before the time of crowdfunding or any of
Right.
that stuff. I mean, my first book that I ever went and got produced was one of my webcomic series. I specifically produced like a 50 odd some page black and white story for my webcomic so that I could go take it to a Kinko's and get it printed. And we printed like 100 copies, and we took it to my first convention. And I was like, look, I've got a little bit of budget. I'm going to set it aside and work on this project with it. I'm going to go to these conventions and sell some books. If I'm successful, I'll use that money to print another book. If I'm not successful, I'll go play video games. And I don't play a lot of video games.
Right.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
That's a good
that was
attitude to
kind of
have.
how it spit rolled. It was the barrier to entry was low. The want and need to have like a massive crew to put together like a film project was not there. It was something that I could
Mm,
either do myself and learn, which I did
right.
with my webcomic self-published work. And then that's when I started to spawn off into other artists and just focus on the writing. And then I was able to balance a lot of projects at the same time, because writing doesn't take nearly as long as the art process does. And
Right.
so I was able to be like, oh, well, instead of producing 1 book a year, I can start producing 3 books a year. I can start producing 6 books a year. like full-on graphic novels, 100, 200 pages. And I can tell more stories and get them out there faster. And for me, that was really kind of the impetus behind why I did comics, is I can tell more stories, I can do it faster, and my barrier to entry is a lot lower. The thing that I always say at conventions, now that we've got things like crowdfunding in place, is that it's never been harder to be published, but it's never been easier to make a comic book. You can do it online for free, costs you
Yeah.
nothing. And you can even use sites like Tumblr, which still exist, even though they're not super popular, but it's
Right.
free hosting, right? It's
Yeah,
free
that's true.
hosting. So there's literally like no cost. Now you can even use like Webtoon and Webtoon Canvas to upload your stuff if you prefer kind of that vertical scroll format versus like the page format. There's literally no reason to not go make a comic if you want to go make a comic, because it's not going to cost you anything but time. I mean, in high school, I was just making like little photocopied comics, right? That I could sell,
Right.
5, 10 copies of to my friends. But in college, I took a break for like 2 years from storytelling. So I was like, oh, I'm paying to be here. I should probably pay attention.
Right.
Um, and then my friends started doing like some online jam comics, right? Like one person writes and draws a page, and then somebody else writes and draws the next page of the same
Oh,
story.
nice. Nice.
And so we kind of kept going with that. And I was like, oh, well, I can do like a page. That's easy. Like, and that started getting me back into drawing and writing. And I was like, oh, I really want to do like my own story now. So then I launched like my own webcomic series. And I didn't understand anything about print at the time. So that webcomic series can never be printed. Like I didn't scan it in at a high enough resolution. I did not
Ah.
make it at a high enough DPI in order to actually get the thing printed. So it will only ever exist digitally, and it's probably about this big on your phone. Uh, but so the next one, right? Like I learned from that, and then the
Right.
next one I did like higher quality scans, higher DPI images, so that way I could steamroll it into an actual printed book. And the first thing I ever self-published was a webcomic. I'd already told the story. The content was already there. I just had
Right.
to format it into a physical book. And I remember quite vividly the very first convention that I went to. I was standing next to my buddy and my mentor at the time, Russell Lissau and Josh Elder, who worked for DC Comics, and they got me like my first guest spot at a convention. And I was so proud to be there with my one little book. And
Yeah.
I was like, guys, is there a better feeling than like putting all your blood, sweat, and tears into like making this book and being able to like hold it in your hand? And they gave me the greatest answer. They said, yes, there is. Seeing that book in somebody else's hand while they're waiting in line to buy it from you.
Woo.
And they
Awesome.
were not
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah. That's a great story. Who is your dream artist to work with?
Oh man, are we
We'll do
talking
we'll do
living
two.
or
We'll do two types. One that is now deceased. If you had an opportunity to work with that person,
sure?
who would it be? And one alive. Which one would it be?
So it's probably going to be a very similar answer. But earlier we were talking about Michael Turner.
Ah,
Michael Turner would have been my dream artist on a project. I met the Aspen crew quite early in my career, back when like Frank Mastromo was still back over at Top Cow as their marketing exec,
okay.
before they had actually launched Aspen. And I was quite close with the entire team over there. I met Mike a couple of times. But and he was such a sweet guy. His art is just so gorgeous and just sings on the page.
Yeah.
And even if it were just a cover gig, like I would love to see my characters rendered by his hand.
Ah, yeah, that would
Um,
have been great.
that would be such a rewarding experience. But honestly, somebody that I would love to work on with a longer project would be like Talent Caldwell.
Mm.
And I love Talent's work. I met Talent at a convention. He was just sitting at like the hotel bar by himself one time, just like sketching. And I was like, why is there nobody talking? It's Talent Caldwell, man.
Yeah.
Like that dude drew Superman. That dude drew like a whole bunch of other comics. Like, and I just went over and started chatting him up. And we became good buddies. And he did do a piece of art for me for my Albert the Alien comic. He just did like a little pinup, little poster
Oh,
for
okay.
free because he just wanted to try a new style. And the more I look at that poster, I hang that poster up at my booth at conventions all the time. And the more I look at it, I'm like, I really want to see like a story done with
Yeah.
that art style. So I would love, love, love to work with talent um, on something at some point. But yeah, so many creators out there that I have kind of my bucket list of who I would want to work with. Talent's towards the top.
What would you say is the most difficult obstacle indie comic book writers face today?
Oh man, so many to choose from. I think it's always going to be the financial one, man. It's a
Financial.
balance between the financial and the time commitment, right?
Right.
That's always the struggle. There's so many times that I'll go to cons and meet people, and they say, you know, oh, I've got this great idea for a story. I just don't have time to do it, or I don't have the
Mm,
skill set to do it. And so you've
right.
got to find the budget to afford an artist to bring that vision to life, and have the flexibility to let them own elements of that story so that they can also feel fulfilled and rewarded, and
Right.
like a contributor and not just like an employee. But then two, it's always this question of time. And the thing that I always tell people is the only barrier to stopping you from making your own comic is you.
Right.
Like, you have to kind of sit there and think about where your priority sits. And if it's not making comics, then you're never going to make one. I'm a guy who, I mean, let's just take the pandemic as an example, right? I was working on 8 graphic novels, 12 pitches, 3 film projects, full-time job, family
Oh
with
man.
kids.
Yeah.
And I'm like, look, like, I
If you can
still
do
get
it,
I still
yeah.
get
If you
6
can
to
do
8
it,
hours of sleep at night.
yeah.
I still get time to do some fun things for me every now and then. But the priority was, I need family first, obviously,
Right.
and then I
Yeah.
need to tell these stories. People always ask, like, well, what stories do you pick? Like, what do you like? What if I got writer's block? All this stuff. I'm like, guys, like, for me, I don't necessarily experience that. I've got a million and one ideas a second. I've got time to do one of them. So when I
Mm,
sit there and I select what story I'm going to work on next, it's the one that's keeping me up at night because it won't leave my head and it won't let me sleep.
I hear
Like,
that. I hear
that's
that.
how I pick my stories. That's how I pick what I'm going to work on. And the only way that that story will leave my head is when I commit it to the screen, when I start typing it down. So this is kind of a long and rambling answer to your question, but
It's a great
the
answer.
biggest barrier there is either time or financial. And the financial one has kind of been overcome with a lot of crowdfunding. And again, there's a time component that's in there to try to build that campaign, get the marketing around it, get the
Right.
messaging going so that people know that it exists. But crowdfunding is at least a discoverable platform where you are going to pull in some new readers who have never heard of you before, that aren't in your social network,
Right.
that are more than 5 people removed from you, potentially.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, the time commitment is really just a question of priority and motivation. And I talk often at conventions about this concept of opportunity cost. It's the only thing I took away from my
Mm,
economics minor. But the concept of opportunity cost is that every decision that you make, every action that you do, comes at the cost of everything else that you could be doing instead. And so, for the people that were sitting in the room during a panel, for the people that are watching your podcast right now, right? The cost of watching this podcast is the list of everything else that they could be doing. Their
right.
laundry, watching the latest episode of, Miss Marvel, you
Yeah.
know, going to work, going for a walk, eating a sandwich, making a sandwich, right? It's an impossibly long list of things that they can do. They're going to select the thing that they value most. And if they value watching this podcast more than everything else, if they value making a comic book and telling their story more than everything else, then that's what you're going to prioritize. That's what you're going to make the time for. And this is why I often encourage new writers to start with short stories, because it's a
Mm,
lot easier to carve out a window of time to tell a 1, 3, 5 page story
right.
than it is to tell a 200-page graphic novel. And so if you can sit there and get into a discipline of carving out time to work on your story, and 5 pages is a fairly reasonable amount of time, right? Like, give yourself
Absolutely.
a week, give yourself 2 weeks, give yourself a month, right? Whatever it is. to work on that one thing. You're not going to kill the rest of the stuff that you do just to get that one short story done. One. And then two, the other thing that I like about short stories is that it gets you into the habit of finishing. And you get
Right.
so many
Yeah.
creators out there that I've got a great idea for a story and it's perfect in my head. And then once you commit it to the page, you're like, oh, I now see the
Yeah.
flaws, I see the dings.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it's
Absolutely.
not perfect, and I'm having difficulty translating it out there,
Right.
but
Right.
it gets you into a point where you can finish. And I had a mentee for a period of time who liked to do narrative prose. She liked to do like short stories, but not with pictures and stuff. And she had this fantastic story that she told me about, but never had a chance to finish. And I told her that I was not going to read it until she finished the story. And she's like, I can't come up with the ending. I don't know how it's going to end. I'm like, just end it. Give it a terrible ending. All of a sudden, a meteor crashes and everybody dies. The end. Like, just give it a terrible ending so you get into that habit of finishing.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You can go back and fix that in a later draft. You can shelve it and come back to it years later. That's fine. But get into a habit of finishing your projects, because at the end of the day, then you at least have something you can show to somebody else or sell at a convention or hand to an agent or an editor to try to get your next gig. But if you've got an incomplete story that's there, that's not going to do you any good.
Right. Nope. It won't. It won't. You're 100% right. That was my problem during my own journey as a writer, is that I had a bad habit of never finishing the stories that I had, cooking up here. And like you, I finally came to the realization that I have to follow through on these grand ideas I have, because if I don't, then I'm never going to get anything done. And I did the same. It's so weird that you and I are kind of in the same wavelength here, because that's the conclusion I came to. Is like, I'm just going to start writing short stories.
Yep.
I'm going to start writing short stories so that way I can have, like you said, the discipline and the habit of finishing what I start. And ever since I've started doing that, which was about 5 years ago, now it's become easier for me to plot out beginning, middle, end. And even though if I don't like the middle or I don't like the end or even the beginning, I can fix that in later drafts as I develop the story. So
The
yeah,
other
great advice. I was gonna be my next question about what advice you have for upcoming younger writers, but you already answered the question.
Well, let me tackle an add-on to that question real quick too, because another benefit of doing short stories, if you're just a writer, is that you get to
Right.
test the waters a little bit more with an artistic partner. It's a lot easier to approach another person for a project that is short and has a definite ending to it
Right.
versus one that's going to last a year, 2 years, right? Especially if it's the first time you're meeting. The way that I like to describe it is I kind of describe it a little bit like dating. The first thing that you say to a person that you've just met isn't, will you marry me?
Right.
It's, will you go out for coffee with me?
Yeah.
And like the short story, the 5, maybe 10 pager, I wouldn't go much longer than 10. The comic book equivalent of will you go out for coffee with me is the short story.
Right.
And when Gabe and I were starting Albert the Alien, an editor had hooked us up for this as a part of an educational anthology. And I pitched it as a 10-page story. They made us cut it down to 8. And Gabe had never illustrated before. This guy won Eisner's for coloring, but he wanted to draw. And he'd never drawn anything before, and nobody would give him a chance. And I was like, I'll give you a chance, buddy. And he designed the cutest character for Albert. And we did an 8-page short story for this anthology. And as that book was coming out, I was like, dude, I really liked working with you on this. Do you want to do another short story? He's like, yeah, let's do it. So we did another like 10 pager, put the script in the back, self-published that. Again, it was something I could hand to editors or sell at conventions. I was like, dude, I really like working on this one. Let's do another one. He's like, I'm in, let's do it. So we did a 22 pager, right?
Wow.
We self-published that as a single issue kind of story. And then I was like, dude, I've got this idea to like turn this into a longer thing. Do you want to spend the next 6 years of your life working with me on this comic? I mean, I didn't define the time, but that's how long it was.
Right.
It was 6 years.
Wow.
And we took those 2 single issues and we were handing them out to editors. We were handing them out to agents. Mark Wade picked it up and he was like, dude, I've got this new website called Thrillbent and I would love to have this on my website. And we were the first young readers syndicated series on Thrillbent. We got nominated
Nice.
for 2 Harvey Awards for working on this comic about the first foreign exchange student from outer space. And then we crowdfunded a new graphic novel every single year, just making 2 pages a week. 2 pages a week was all we updated as a webcomic, built up an audience, funneled that over into a Kickstarter campaign to get a physical copy of the book, made a bunch of extra stories in the back matter of the book. So we're producing like 150 to a 200-page graphic novel a year for 5 years in a row.
But it was a slow burn, right? It was a slow buildup. You started small, and then eventually it got a snowball, right? It started getting bigger and bigger with time.
But the relationship started with short stories.
The relationship with the short story,
yeah.
The coffee.
And so again, as you think about, right, it got us into the habit of finishing. It got us to understand how we work together. Gabe struggles with layout. So he likes a little bit more direction on layout. So again, for 6 years working with him, like I would put layout description into my scripts. And it became so natural that I started doing it when I spawned out into other artists. And they were like, dude, don't give me that. Like, I want the freedom to be able to do this myself.
Right.
Like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So
yeah, you gotta pick and choose your battles. That's what I've learned too.
That was when I realized and I guess remembered that a comic book script isn't for me. It's for them.
It's for them, right?
You know,
Absolutely.
It's for the artist, and whatever they need is what you have to put in there.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The artist I'm currently working with now, I asked him what kind of script you prefer. Do you want the tight script or do you want the loose script? He chose the loose script because he wanted more room to breathe and you know, he wants to be challenged. He wants to challenge himself. That's what he told me.
Yep.
And so you're right. Everyone's different, and it depends on who you're working with, and a lot of the time it works out.
Well, and that's the kind of relationship that I've tried to forge with most, if not all, of my artists. And it doesn't always work out that way, right? That's why the short story is helpful. You can identify that quick and be like, oh, I don't like working with you, but I'm just going to professionally bow out, right?
Yeah.
I've had people do that to me. I've done that to other people as well. But again, that's what the coffee is for.
Exactly.
Right? Not the 200-page magnum opus graphic novel that's going to make us millions and millions of dollars, and Hollywood is going to throw money at us, buddy. Like, let's do it. I'm working with an artist right now in Canada who's never made a comic book before. Her background is in doing storyboard layouts for like film and TV. So she understands visual storytelling. But like the page layout is a completely foreign concept to her, and she's crushing it. But so long as I can give her like, oh, this is a horizontal panel at the top, this is a vertical panel off to the side. So long as I can give her that kind of direction and show her like how it flows on the page, she's brilliant. She'll fill those panels with, you know, art. I mean, it is gorgeous. The stuff that she's turning in. And as she does that more and more, she'll start to figure out like how that story flows, why you use certain panel types for things, and she'll be able to apply that to her own stories.
All right. It looks like I got everything. I asked all the questions I wanted to ask, and you gave some great answers. And I think a lot of people who are going to watch this episode are going to learn a lot, especially those who are thinking about writing comics. Real quick, you know, I know you gave a lot of advice, but which other tad of advice would you give an up-and-coming writer of comics?
Outside of start short and
outside of all that, is there anything else you want to add to that advice, or you know, everything?
A lot of people I think kind of get fixated on this one big epic story that they want to tell, and they struggle to try to figure out ways to condense that down into a short story, or to think of a different story that could potentially fit within a short story. My advice on that one is take your characters from your epic story that you want to do and tell a smaller tale with them. The thing that I like to talk about during panels is I call it the milk run story. How do your characters go to the grocery store to get milk? And considering that story is really made up of 4 elements, right? It's characters with kind of a defined motivation. It's a situation, it's an environment, and it's time. And time is really just hitting the play button, right? And letting the story kind of write itself. So that story becomes quite different if you're doing a fantasy story, or if you're doing a sci-fi story, or a story in space, or a story on an alien world. But even in a story that takes place in our own contemporary timeline, you can have a lot of fun with that. You can tell the basic story where somebody gets up, realizes they're out of milk, goes to the store, gets it, comes back, and then eats their cereal, and it's a satisfying story. You can sit there and put more hurdles in there where they can't find their keys, or their car has a flat tire, or whatever, right? The more hurdles you put in front of your character for trying to accomplish their goal, the longer the story becomes. But you can also just go wild with it, where like they go to the grocery store, and the grocery store is suddenly caught in the middle of a mob war between two rival families that have want control of that street corner.
Right.
And they're like, I need to get my milk and go home, man. Or my favorite one, they walk out of their house and a light shines on top of them, and they look up and go, oh crap, and they get abducted by aliens. And suddenly they're in space, but they need to get back to Earth to buy that gallon of milk so that they can have their breakfast because they want milk. Like, you can have so much fun with just that one premise and that one story. So if you're stuck and fixated on this magnum opus story, you've got these characters in your head that are fleshed out, you can use those characters to tell a shorter story. And that, again, gets you into the discipline of finishing. That allows you to find an artist to work with you on a short-term kind of commitment. And that allows for a project that is not overly burdensome in terms of finances or in terms of time.
Where can they find you? Where can people find you, Trevor?
Trevor A Mueller is my Twitter, my Facebook, my Instagram, my TikTok, my YouTube, my website. Find me, follow me, friend me. I am on social all the time. My website's constantly updating with things. And again, lots of new stuff coming out because of the webtoons that I've got out right now about, again, trying to make stuff for the vertical scroll versus just the printed page. Yeah, there's the Nexus point on the website right now.
Yeah, there you go. So you can find his website is trevormueller.com, where
TrevorAMueller.com.
Trevor A Mueller, excuse me, .com, and there you can find the latest updates of his website, where he's going to be at, which conventions he's going to be visiting, his social media platforms, and again, he has a webtoon comic called Nexus Point, which has sound, which was great.
The first episode. Yeah, the first episode has music on there from former Power Ranger turned anime voice actor Johnny Young Bosch.
Oh.
Who's a buddy of mine, and he also did the voice work for the trailer that we made, which is on YouTube.
Nice.
So he did an original 6-minute song for this first episode, and then he's got more music coming for some of our later episodes. But yeah, it's a cyberpunk action story about hackers versus bounty hunters. The story is about this young girl named Jemmy Reynolds, who doesn't appear until halfway through the first episode. And she starts her first, she's a hacker by trade, right? And so there are good guy hackers and bad guy hackers. And she's a good guy hacker. She works for a company to help them find security flaws. And on her first day at the job, she sees a file that she's not supposed to see. And suddenly she's pulled into a world where she's being hunted by bounty hunters and crooked cops and this mysterious paramilitary organization. And the only person that can keep her safe is this guy that you're seeing on the first half of the episode, Jack Travis, who is a former police detective turned bounty hunter with a mysterious past. And his past is tied in to the file that she's seen, and they have to find out how and stop the bad guys before it's too late. Webtoon operates very similarly to Amazon Prime, where in launch week, you get 3 episodes for free. There are 3 episodes available for early access purchase. They call it Fast Pass. But those episodes will be made available for free on a weekly basis. So I think it's Saturday is when we update. Every Saturday you'll get a new episode. So episode 4 will become available on this week, Saturday, 5 next week, right? So you can read the entire series for free. It'll just come out in weekly installments, like an episode on a streaming platform.
Gotcha. All right. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. So Nexus Point, you still are working on the Webtoons link for the second project you're working on, right?
Yeah. So Repossessed comes out in August. It hasn't launched just yet. but it'll be out then. It's a very different kind of story. I'll tell you the premise, which kind of inspired the title. It's about a college kid who who gets cut off financially from his parents and is forced to get his first job working at a mysterious pawn shop that sells demonically possessed furniture. He's accidentally sold some of the more deadlier pieces, and he has to get them back before they kill somebody. It's called Repossessed.
Nice. That sounds great. That sounds like a really good one. I
I
might have to
consider it
check one
a
out.
supernatural workplace comedy, kind of like Clerks meets Army of Darkness. To the webtoons, please like and subscribe. Please give us a rating. And if you subscribe, then it'll tell you whenever it updates, so you don't have to just check back every Saturday. Like it'll shoot you a little notification so that you know, hey, new episode, come check it out.
Thank you again for being on the show.
Mhm.
And I really do appreciate your insights and appreciate you sharing the knowledge that you've gained in the years that you've been working in the comic book field. And I'm happy that you reached out to me for the interview because, like I said, there's not enough love for writers, at least in my part of the social media spectrum. Everything's all about art, and rightfully so. This is an art-driven industry. Without the artists, there will be no industry. There will be no people coming into the shops and picking up books. But the writers are the ones who keep you coming back. And I think that a lot of readers don't really see that just yet until later on. Obviously, when you start to, get more and more books published, then the readers start to trust your brand, your product, and they keep coming back. And then you start building a nice foundation base of readers.
The way I like to think about it, right? It's a collaborative process. Both are so critical to the process.
Yes.
The artist is going to catch your eye.
Yeah.
The writer's going to keep your attention.
There you go.
Right? The writer's job is to get you to turn that page. The artist's job is to get you to pick up that book. Like everybody's got a role to play in the process of making comics. And when writer and artist are working in sync and firing on all levels, it is such a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, what makes books successful.
Don't forget to check out his website, trevораmueller.com. Check out his webtoon comic, Repossessed, which is coming out in August, and Nexus Point, which is out now. Mm-hmm. And give him a follow on Twitter, follow him on Facebook and any other social media platforms that he's available on. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment, leave suggestions. It'd be appreciated. And we'll see you on the next one. See ya.
Thanks, guys.